Hi everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on assessment validation today. And my name is Mel Hartley and I'm one of the team here at the Training Accreditation Council. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. And now I'd like to introduce Claire Werner, who is our facilitator for today. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Mel, and welcome everybody. It's great to have you with us today. So today our plan is we have 90 minutes to look at assessment validation, and the main content of the session we're hoping to get through in about 60 to 70 minutes and leave us 20 minutes for questions. The topics that we're going to touch on today is, really why do we have this focus on assessment quality in the RTO standards, how assessment validation contributes to that. We're going to talk about pre-use, in-use and post-use validation, who can be involved in that process and what that might lead to. Okay, so the vet sector is really a critical contributor to the economic success of our country. Last year, about 31% of our population actually held a vocational qualification, and of those people, 85% of them were employed. So we are a huge contributor to our country, and our regulation is really constructed to focus RTOs who deliver those services to generate quality outcomes for their learners, for industry, ultimately our community and our country. So regulatory audits happen once every 7 years, and depending on what you do as an RTO, you might possibly have audits more frequently within that time frame. So things like changing your scope, being involved in a strategic audit, potentially complaints about your RTO, they are all things that may generate an audit. Ultimately, however, the responsibility for ensuring quality actually rests with the RTO, and standards are there to help focus your efforts in monitoring the quality of the services that your RTO provides and improving those outcomes. So when we talk about assessment, these are the key clauses in our regulation that focus us. So we have clauses 1.9 through to 1.11, and they require that assessments that are associated with the training products that are on our scope as an RTO be validated at least every 5 years. Now, the 5 years that sits in there kind of links back to our old time frame for registration. So it used to be 5 years and now it's 7 years, but our regulation still says 5 years. Clause 1.8 is in there because this requires validity of the RTO's assessment system, including the assurance that assessment policies and procedures and materials and tools meet the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence when we're talking about judgments. So the purpose of assessment validation is really to make sure that the certification that we issue, so that could be qualifications or it could be statements of attainment, they're accurate and they're credible because they're based upon sound judgments made within our organisations. Assessment validation might confirm that outcome, that you have made sound judgments, or it might provide you with guidance on how to actually achieve that outcome. So assessment validation always needs to be risk-based. It is most often triggered by a routine validation plan, an appeal or some other feedback that warrants investigation on your part. So this could be your own internal review processes, it could be feedback from trainers, or it could be industry feedback. There's lots of ways that that can come to you. The outcomes of assessment validation and appeals have to contribute to the quality assurance of your RTO's operations, and this is where Standard 2 comes into play. Specifically 2.1, where we're saying you have to comply with the standards at all times, and systematically monitoring your assessment strategies, which is 2.2a. Evaluating and improving your assessment strategies is 2.2b, and monitoring the services, including assessment services delivered by a third party, that's 2.3 and 2.4. So for those of you who have been watching the development of the new regulation, you'll see that these same concepts are also included in the revisions that are being proposed. So it's something that has always been there, and it's something that will continue to remain a focus for us. So assessment validation involves a systematic and analytic process to actually evaluate your assessment tools, the processes, and the judgments that you make within defined standards. In the VET sector, we do have defined outcome standards, and they're called units of competency. We also have defined process standards. These are the rules of evidence. And we define our judgments by the principles of assessment. So our current standards are virtually silent about the quality of training delivery. And so this makes the quality of assessment critical to quality assurance in our RTO, hence the focus that we have on assessment validation. This is the definition that actually sits in our standards as they are today. It's in the glossary, and it's on page 13 of the glossary. This definition is actually really useful as it links the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence, but not all of them, and ties the process to review of existing assessment evidence and judgments. So it also stresses that making recommendations and taking action to improve assessment processes is important. And, you know, when we have a look at what RTOs do and don't do, it's often that follow through, that closing the loop. And those of you who know me will have heard me say that many times, where we look at how those actions have actually been implemented and whether they're working. But I want to draw your attention to a few terms that sit in this definition and to let you know how TAC views these terms. And the first word is reasonable. This is on the third line. Actually, it's on the second line on your slide. Your slide's slightly different to mine. So reasonable really allows a level of subjectivity, and it's our view that this actually means a valid judgment. So when it says you have authentic evidence to enable reasonable judgments, we're saying it should be reasonable. Reasonable should be a valid judgment of competence. And this is supported by the requirements of 1.8 in the principles of assessment, in that we must have validity in there. The phrase statistically valid is also one that we want to talk about, and we'll talk about quite a bit through this session. For our purposes, we could have a sample that is statistically valid. And the idea is that you are able to make meaningful inferences about the range of assessment events that have occurred in your RTO. So you need to have a sample that is right, so that you can say, yes, when we have a look at this sample, this is representative of what our RTO actually does. Sometimes a statistically valid sample doesn't actually allow us to do that because it doesn't cover enough of what we do. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that a little later. We still find that RTOs are repeating their pre-use validation and checking. So they check the rules of evidence, they check the principles of assessment met, but they're not checking the actual outcomes of the use of the tools. So ultimately, RTOs will decide how they're going to do this, but this workshop is really designed to draw your attention to the criteria that actually underpins the process, whatever process you might use in your RTOs. Okay, so let's think about what a quality review might look like. when we think about assessment validation, we really need to address all of the following. This is because when we're talking about validation, we're not just talking about validation of a tool, we're talking about validation of an assessment system. So we need to have a look at the definition of competency as it exists in the glossary for our standards and make sure we understand what we're trying to achieve. We have to have a look at the adequacy of the resources and the time that we are allocating to assessment. And this is linked to clauses 1.1 to 1.4 of our regulation. We have to make sure that there is industry relevance. This is clauses 1.5 and 1.6 currently. We have to have a look at whether the assessment process is responsive to the individual's needs. This is 1.7 and 1.12. 1.12, of course, is RPL. We have to have a look and make sure that the quality of the assessment process is right. So we're going to look at processes, we're going to look at tools, we're going to look at judgments. So this is where we are looking at the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence. They're linked to clause 1.8. And we're going to have a look at the credentials of the people who are actually conducting the assessment and any observers that we might be using. So this is where we are linking into clauses 113 to 120. So the reality is when we're looking at validation of our assessment system, it really touches nearly everything that we do as an RTO. Because of that, when we think about validation, validation can occur at each stage of an assessment process. So there are things that you can do at the design stage, which is your pre-use validation, at the application stage when you're actually starting to use the assessment, and at the judgment stage, which is where we talk about post-use validation. So there's one of those terms in there, of course, that we don't use very frequently, and that is the in-use validation. We are going to talk about that as we move through this session. Okay, so let's start with pre-use validation. This is one we are all familiar with. When we're talking about pre-use validation, we're talking about making sure that the assessment system, the tools, the processes that we're going to use look right, feel right before we use them. So this is a stage of assessment validation that can be undertaken by a range of people. The assessor, for example, can be involved in this. The designers can be involved in this. You might even choose to have an independent person involved in this. And it really applies to every unit of competency and every assessment tool that you might be using, including RPL. So that doesn't matter whether it is assessment that has been designed by the RTO or whether it's assessment that has been purchased. Ultimately, when you are looking at this pre-use validation, you're trying to do a few things. So first, you're trying to make sure that it reflects the unit of competency requirements that it is linked to, that there are suitable and accessible resources available for the actual implementation of the assessment, that it reflects industry's needs, and you've heard lots of these before, responds to the student's needs, meets the rules of evidence for validity and sufficiency, meets the principles of assessment for validity and reliability, and of course that when we're doing it, we're actually using vet and industry expertise in the shape of the assessor or the assessment team to actually implement the assessment. So pre-use validation is a really valuable check by the RTO to make sure that the assessment looks like it's going to do what we want it to do. We need to talk about pre-use validation of assessment tools that are actually developed by somebody else. When you develop your own assessment tools, you're responsible for making sure that all of the unit requirements are appropriately addressed in the assessment tools. And, many RTOs use some kind of mapping process to make sure that the assessment tools gather evidence that's going to be valid and sufficient. So you will align your assessment tools to the requirements of the unit of competency in a mapping. Probably 95% of RTOs use that mapping process. When you use an assessment tool that is developed by somebody else, you actually have the same responsibility to confirm that that tool is actually going to gather sufficient and valid evidence. This includes industry-approved tools, industry-validated tools, industry-preferred tools, those developed by industry skills councils or their successors, and, of course, those that develop the training packages themselves sometimes. You have to consider copyright, as this might prevent you from making changes to the tools, in which case you need to consider what you're going to do and you might not actually be able to use them. The reason that we're talking about this is because there have been some really serious flaws identified in validated assessment tools, mandatory assessment tools, and the high-risk units of competency are a good example. Within those mandatory assessment tools, failure to assess all knowledge evidence items has been identified, assessing performance criteria with knowledge evidence, which of course is linked to a task, failure to meet performance evidence requirements, they're sometimes missed. And the issue with all of this, of course, is that these could lead to an incorrect judgment of competency. So you might make a decision that someone is competent when they're not, or vice versa. You might make a decision that someone is not yet competent when they are actually competent. So as the user of the tool, the assessor and the RTO are responsible for competency decisions and any consequences arising from that. You need to make sure that they're right. So, while we don't like to put the black hat on, the reality is sometimes there's litigation that arises from incorrect judgments. If there's accidents in the workplace, if there's deaths in the workplace, and you are the assessor who's made decisions and those tools have not been checked, then, any investigation is always going to come back and look at what you have done. So I guess it's really saying buyer beware and, be prudent about how you make sure that the tools are correct. So when you're doing this pre-assessment validation, what exactly are you going to review? So you've got a list on the screen in front of you. So you're going to have a look at the unit of competency requirements, and that's really to make sure that you understand all of the training package requirements and what they're looking for. This is clause 1.8a. You're going to have a look at the training and assessment strategy. The vast majority of RTOs have a document called Training and Assessment Strategy. Sometimes it's called something different. It's that overall plan for how you're going to deliver a qualification. And that is the purpose of having a look at that document, is to understand how that unit fits into the context of the qualification. Is it assessed by itself? Is it assessed in a cluster? Where does it happen in the flow of things? How is it matched to what the needs of industry are? All of those things are often documented in a strategy type document. A lot of organisations will also have something that they will call a learning and assessment plan or a delivery and assessment plan. And this is really where we move away from a qualification level and to an individual unit of competency or a cluster of units of competency and see how we're dealing with this. So when we're looking at that, we're looking to see how the assessment tools are coordinated within that learning sequence. We'll have a look at the assessment mapping document, and of course that's to see how the assessment tools relate to the units of competency and the requirements that are documented there. We will have a look at the knowledge evidence tools and any marking guides that we have in place, and that is really to confirm that the questions are sitting at the right level, and that the content is aligned. When we're having a look at the skills assessment tools and the observation guides, sometimes you might call them benchmarks, this is to make sure that we can see how those tasks are constructed and that they will actually allow you to observe the unit's skill components. The assessment summary or judgment tool is to see how the learner's performance is used to actually make that assessment judgment. And of course, when we have a look at the RPL process and RPL tools, we're making sure that we can see how the evidence is gathered and used for the RPL process. We might also have a look at the assessor's credentials in here to make sure that the assessor is able to actually develop, manage, or utilise the assessments. When we are happy that the assessment resources that we have and that we're going to use are valid, we can put them into practice. And of course, then we're looking to move to look at how well they're used within the RTO. Okay, so we have a question here for you with Mentimeter. And what we're wanting you to know is when you have been conducting pre-assessment validation, what types of issues have you seen with the assessment materials when you actually conduct this? So we can see some of the responses that you are popping up there. Lack of marking guides or exemplars, it's a really common one. The mapping is not aligned. Inconsistent assessment naming is a really common one. Marking guides that say use expert judgment, or another one that they will often say is participants' answers will differ. It's not very helpful for you. Mel, could you scroll down those a little bit so we can see the ones past there? No assessors, instructions, or in the marking guides. Yep, wrong AQF level. That is again a very, very common issue. An element that's partially assessed in one task and partially in another, so it's fragmented. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Mapping not aligned, inconsistent assessment name. Oh, we're back up at the top, are we? Or are they repeated? They're repeated. Mapping not aligned. Mapping is incorrect. Yep. Okay. So we've got some quite common things that are appearing in that slide there. What I want to do is just pick one of those. And the one that's probably appearing most commonly is that the mapping is not aligned. So the next question that we want to ask you is, when you find that in your pre-assessment validation, how do you fix that issue? So what would your suggestions be for fixing the issue of the mapping is not aligned or shows that the assessment tools are not aligned to the units? So again, if you could answer those questions, we would be very grateful. Okay, so there are some great suggestions coming up there. And a few of them are clearly linked to the fact that you might be using assessment tools that have been designed by or developed by an external party, so conducting your own mapping, remapping your own document, do your own mapping. I couldn't agree with you more. There's also some great suggestions in there about how to help the person who might have done the original mapping and has not quite got it right. So make sure that the assessor knows how to map correctly, assist them to remap, using a panel to actually come to an agreement about that. They're very, very good suggestions. Yep, use several instructors, several instructors. Ensure SMEs are contacted to redesign and map at the same time. Yep, PD for assessment tool developers. Great. And because the reality is that the reason that might not align can be many. So we've got to figure out why we got it wrong and then fix that. So let's move to talking about in-use validation. So this one is a term that you are not going to be used to seeing. We commonly in our sector talk about pre-use validation and we talk about post-use validation. But you have to remember that we are validating our assessment system. And when we only focus on pre-use and post-use, we're missing a really rich source of information about our assessments at their first uses. So these observations could be made through assessor feedback. They could be made through learner feedback. It's possible that you could have an independent person observing what's happening. Often when we first use a new suite of assessment tools, there's a lot of internal focus on making sure that they're working in the way that they should work. Excuse me. And really what we're saying is those things that you typically do when you start using an assessment tool, make sure that you use that information and data that you get to help improve the tool's go. So when we're talking about in-use assessment validation, we're making sure that the use of the tool, that we check that there is a clarity for the assessor or the observer in the instructions that we have put in the tool, that for the learners, again, the instructions to them are clear and understandable, the fidelity of the administration of the tool, so we're making sure that they work as they should do, that they're being used as they're supposed to be being used, that the recording methods that we're using are actually suitable, and that the tools work for the learner. So we want to understand the impact on the learner. So it's quite common for us to design assessment tools thinking that they're going to work, and when we start to use them, they don't quite work as we intended. So when we are looking at in-use validation, we want to make sure that the assessor or the observer actually complies with the administration instructions. And it sounds really obvious, but one of the most common non-compliances that we have is when assessors don't use the tools as they are intended to be used. So we want to make sure that we have got adequate time and resources to actually use the assessments. And again, that first use is a great time for us to test and make sure that that's right, that they do actually respond appropriately to individuals' needs, that we meet the rules of evidence in terms of authenticity and currency, and that first collection of evidence gives us an opportunity to do that, that we meet the principles of assessment in terms of fairness and flexibility. So as we are using them, are they fair and flexible? And we want to make sure that the person who is using the tools is in fact suitably qualified to use the tools. So that might not be only in terms of vocational competence, industry, currency, but that they actually, know how to use these tools properly, how to put them into practice. So, quite a common thing that I will often see RTOs do is, when they're putting a new suite of assessment tools into place, and that could be because, there's been a change of qualification or things have been rewritten for a different group, they will have all the assessors come together first so that everybody's on the same page in terms of how these tools will be used. So again, in terms of who is involved in this validation, depending upon what you find in the reviews that you are doing, you might have the assessors working together to do this. You might have an independent person. So it could be, for example, a supervisor or a manager who is involved. It could be an external person that is involved in this. So in-use validation, we don't often talk about it. We often do it. What we're suggesting to you is you use the information that you already collect. And then we get to post-use validation. So post-use validation, of course, is an area that all RTOs undertake, and it has to be conducted by an independent validator. So this applies to every training product. It doesn't matter if it's a standalone unit, if it's a skill set, or if it's a qualification, every 5 years. So in making the assessment decision, what we are looking to do is to make sure that the assessor manages and monitors any observers that might be involved in the assessment process, that they gather all of the relevant evidence, that they distribute clustered evidence appropriately. When we are doing clustered assessment, we will often, we do collect evidence that is used in multiple units. So we have to make sure that the evidence that is for a specific unit is allocated to that unit to make sure that we can make the decision at unit level, which is what we always do. So we have to ensure that any evidence that we accept and use for our judgments meets the rules of evidence. We have to make sure that the principles of assessment have actually been applied properly. So the process, how we do the assessment, meets the principles of assessment. We have to ensure that vet and industry expertise is actually involved. This is how we credential our trainers and assessors. And we have to make sure that we have gathered evidence of quality, including any follow-up. So when we think about this, we have got a couple of clauses that are guiding how we're doing this. We've got clauses 1.9 to 1.11. And so these clauses tell us that there are specific things that we have to have. We have to have a systematic plan, and that generally involves policies and processes for how validation is going to be managed within your RTO. We have to have a validation schedule. That schedule is going to be risk-based. We have to make sure that every training product, so if you offer a standalone unit, that's a training product. If you offer a skill set, that's a training product. If you offer a qualification, that's a training product. So every training product is validated at least once in a 5-year time period, and 50% of those are done within the first 3 years. And these also tell us about the personnel who are involved. So this is independent qualified people who are conducting the validation for us. Now, this is one of the areas that has changed or has been impacted by the early changes to the standards. We're going to have a look at that in a minute, and information on that is actually available on page 2 of TAC's fact sheet around validation. So a validation plan for a qualification often identifies every unit as high risk because qualification is high risk. RTOs need to really look at those individual units and consider, how does that unit contribute to this qualification? All qualifications are going to have units that pose a greater risk to quality than others. And really, it's about having a look at the relative risk rating of the units within the qualification to determine the priority of units that might, in fact, be validated. So a representative sample of the student's work is what we would then use to do that validation. And again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. When you use a random sample, what tends to happen is you get huge sample sizes. So what we're suggesting is that you should actually be using a stratified random sample. And what this means is that you're going to identify distinct student cohorts, and then you're going to randomly select from within those cohorts. And you might start with 2 students from each cohort, and then depending upon what you find, you might extend that sample. The use of those simple random samples where you get huge sample numbers is often counterproductive. And sometimes, what can happen is that within that random sample, you don't really see everything that is happening in your RTO. So you get real variability if you only stick to that idea of a random sample. Right, let's talk about these early changes because they are important. So really what they have done is they've impacted two areas where it's linked to validation that's carried out in the RTO. The first is the training and assessment credential that is detailed in Schedule 1, Item 2. And of course, this now includes the TAE 40122 qualification, the latest TAE qualification. The second change is the addition of clause 1.11b, which you can see in purple there on the screen. That second change impacts who can be involved in the validation. So in the past, validation had to be undertaken by people who were not involved in the delivery and assessment of that training product. If the assessors were involved, they were simply there to clarify any information that the validation team might want. So you might have had questions for the assessors, for example. They would have answered those questions and then they wouldn't have been involved anymore. This new clause, 1.11b, changes that. So the assessor can now be involved in the validation process as long as they are not solely responsible for determining the validation outcomes. So in reality, what this means is that the assessor can be part of the validation team. Right. Our representative sample. In the glossary for our standards, this is described as a statistically valid sample. We've mentioned that previously. Statistically valid is defined in the glossary as a random sample of an appropriate size to enable confidence that the result is sufficiently accurate to be accepted as representative of the total population of assessments in the RTO. As I mentioned, the issue with these definitions is you often end up with huge sample sizes, so we are recommending that you use a stratified random sample. And the key, of course, is figuring out what to include in your sample. So let's have a think about that. If we were creating a stratified random sample and we were looking for those distinct cohorts, what we'd like you to do is to think about each of these points on here. If you were creating this stratified random sample, in these areas, which of them do you think should be included when you are developing your sample? Look at that. So we all think all of them should be included. And I'm very glad about that because that's great. So when we are looking at a stratified random sample, we're looking at removing variations. Okay. So basically all of those have got a really high rating on them. The idea is that the strata or things that we take into consideration are distinct student cohorts. So the things that we might use to decide whether it's a distinct cohort that we have to include in the sample could, for example, be who the assessor and observer is. We'd want to make sure that we had samples from each assessor or observer who was involved in the assessment of the unit. We would want to make sure that we had samples from each distinct student cohort. So sometimes you might have qualifications that are offered institutionally on campus. You might have those same qualifications also being offered in a traineeship. You might have those same qualifications being offered in an online mode. And so in those circumstances, you would want to have a look at those cohorts and make sure that they are all included in your sample. When you have third-party arrangements, third-party arrangements are always considered high risk by every regulator. It doesn't matter whether it's TAC, ASWA, or the VRQA. It is a situation where you have a third party and all of the things that come with that, where they might use tools differently. So we would always suggest that you include a sample from a third party. We would also have a sample if you had any RPL, because of course in RPL, the students might in fact be offering you different evidence to the evidence that is generated by your assessment tools. So again, there are circumstances where the assessor might make a different judgment based upon the evidence that they're looking at. The important thing to remember is that there has to be a reason for identifying the cohort, a logical reason as to why these cohorts would differ from one another. When you have got your cohorts, then you can take a random sample of assessments from within each of those cohorts. So you're having a look at that. When you see that everything is working perfectly, as an organisation, you might be satisfied that that cohort is given you, or that the sample that you have put into place is representative and does give you confidence in the judgments that are made. You might also see some issues in there, in which case you might then extend the sample. It could be a particular assessor, it could be the online group, it could be the RPL process. So when you have a look at that extended sample, again, it's about saying, can I be confident in the judgments that have been made within this cohort? If I can't, what do I need to do to fix it? So there's lots and lots of things for you to think about in terms of creating your sample. Okay. So when we are looking at the evidence or sources of evidence that we could use for our post-assessment validation, you have a list sitting there in front of you on the screen. So we could have a look at the credentials of the assessors just to make sure that everyone is meeting the requirements for vocational competency, industry currency, training and assessment skill, and professional development. You might do some analysis of documents. So you might have a look at what was done in the pre-use validation, for example. You might have a look at the use of the assessment tools, which you might have got from your in-use validation. So what kind of feedback were you getting? How is that played out in terms of the sample you're now looking at? We have, of course, the sample of student evidence that we're having a look at, the representative sample of student evidence. You might be able to have a look at any reassessment that has been undertaken. So you're having a look at test and retest consistency. You're looking for authentication in those tests. You might have feedback from observers, so you might have your own internal audits where they have been able to watch the assessment process being undertaken. Feedback from candidates, that could include feedback surveys, evaluation surveys. It might include appeals. It might include complaints that have been made. You could follow up graduates, so post-training surveys. And you might also have feedback from industry. So when we are having a look at whether these students can do the work once they actually land in industry, you might also have feedback from the vet regulators. So that could be in the form of external audits, but it could also be in the form of bulletins that they might put out where they're saying, we understand that there is an issue here and we want you to make sure that you are doing this, this, and this. A good example of that was the advice that was recently put out from TAC to training organisations who deliver the heavy vehicle licences. So there was some advice provided saying, you know, when you're doing your assessment, watch out for these things. We're being told that they are concerns. So there is a lot of information available to you to help you have a look at whether your assessment system is actually doing what it's supposed to do. So we have some more questions for you in Mentimeter. So this first question is about how you would improve assessments when the context is artificial. So this is where you are simulating the workplace or replicating the workplace to conduct an assessment. What kinds of things could you do to actually improve that assessment for that type of context? Okay, so we've got some responses in there. So a number of you are suggesting that we use case studies and making sure that those case studies actually reflect what is happening in industry. That's a great suggestion. Case studies can be really useful in simulation type activities. And it's just making sure that there's enough information in them that actually makes them, realistic. And of course, in those circumstances, often means there has to be some kind of supporting information or documents to replicate what might happen in the workplace. So again, many of you are talking about using simulation that's as close to the real context as possible. And it's often that pressure that exists in industry that you don't get in simulations. So consulting with industry helps you to do that. Using SMEs in the process, again, helps you to do that. Using equipment that's currently available in industry helps you to do that. So if you could scroll down a bit, Mel. Okay, just go up a tiny bit because I've spotted the word role play. Okay, role plays. Role plays are a fabulous tool for you to use. They are also very hard to get right. So often in role plays, we don't give enough information to the people who are actually going to be the role players or the actors in the scenario. And what that means is for the person who's being assessed, you can get a lot of variability in terms of how the role play works. So for those of us who have got an inner drama queen, we might dive into that role play and create a situation that is either way in excess of what we might be expecting, or for those of us who don't have an inner drama queen, we might actually not be wanting to participate, and we don't do or set up the series of things that would allow the person who's being assessed to actually demonstrate their skill. So when we're talking about role plays, it's not only information that's given to the person who's being assessed, it's how we set it up for all the people who are going to be actors in the role plays. The other thing that we would suggest with that is if you're going to use a role play in assessment, then you should be using role plays in the training process as well. And that gets everyone involved used to and comfortable with the situation so that they can fairly participate when it comes to the assessment process. So great tool, you just have to set them up properly. Yes, and so there's a few more responses I just want to touch on. Ensuring the tasks are related to real workplace scenarios. Quite often with our units of competency, and this varies a bit from training package to training package, when you look at a unit of competency sitting by itself, it's not reflective of how a task would be done in the workplace. You generally have to join lots of units of competency together to get what a task might look like in the workplace. So you might find that when you're using relations and role plays, things like that, that they might actually gather evidence for many units for you to be realistic as to what you might find in the workplace. Having a portfolio of evidence from a real workplace is ideal. When we can't get that, we have lots of other suggestions there to help us along the way. Okay, so that's a great list. Thank you very much for that. Our next question is, sometimes when you go through and you have a look at the assessment tasks, what you find is you've got skills that are actually being assessed by knowledge questions. So what suggestions would you have to improve assessments where the skills are actually assessed by knowledge questions? Yeah. So you're absolutely on the right track there in your responses. And probably the word that's popping out to me is just don't do it. I've seen that about 4 or 5 times so far in there. When we are assessing skills, it's our obligation is to give the candidates the opportunity to demonstrate what they can do, and that's what we should see in the assessment process. So the suggestions that you have made, things like redesigning the assessment, having scenarios or simulations, making sure that we're including practicals or increasing the demonstrations are great suggestions for how you might do that. So it's a really important message. Knowledge is assessed by knowledge questions or a knowledge task. Skills are assessed by demonstration of some kind. Okay. So we have another question for you. And this links back to something that you actually said a little earlier in the session. How would we improve assessments where the elements and performance criteria have actually been fragmented? So this is where we might have one element and all of its associated performance criteria. Instead of being in a cohesive task, they're split up into lots of different tasks. What would you do in those circumstances? How could you improve that? Okay, so we've got some great responses in there as well. And I just want to draw your attention one that's in the middle of the screen now. Can we just go back up one? Yep, thanks, Mel. It says plan and use the elements as outcomes and the PCs to support the outcome. Our elements, the performance criteria in the elements are inextricably linked. So when we look at an element, the performance criteria are those things that we have agreed on nationally, allow us to make a judgment about whether that element has been achieved by the learner or not. So when the unit is written well, they should never, ever be fragmented. There are times when the units are a little hard to make sense of, but fundamentally those PCs should be looked at as a whole, and therefore your suggestions about rewriting, rephrasing, making sure that the task does actually reflect what the element requires, having one larger task rather than lots of little fragmented tasks, are really good suggestions. So sometimes it might mean that you need to cluster to do that, but fundamentally it's probably going to involve a validation and a rewrite as is suggested there. So I think, when you have a look at your responses to these questions, fundamentally we all understand what good looks like when it comes to assessment. And when we see these kinds of challenges that we've just looked at, these last 3 things are very common to see in assessment tools, we know how to fix those things and we should be fixing them. So when we are conducting validation and we go through this process, there are many, many things that might then change in the way our assessment system works. So you might find that you have changes, or the outcomes of validation create changes to your assessment strategies and tools. You might have changes in regards to your assessors and observers. You might have changes related to the management of the assessment, to the use of the tools themselves, to the judgment process that you use for assessment, the strategy and any subsequent or cascading down documents like a learning and assessment plan or a delivery plan. There might be implications for other assessors and other training products, your RTO systems, your procedures, your policies, and it might lead to professional development. So there are a whole range of outcomes that might result from validation, but key to all of it is that all of those outcomes are about improvement. So keep in mind that most validation actually involves samples, so it's important to ask the question, does this apply to other units? I'm making a change in this unit, in this assessment tool. Have I made the same kinds of, or do we experience the same kinds of issues in other units within the same qualification? So when we are looking at assessment, we make sure that we offer the best possible assessment process system for our learners to get the best possible outcome, and that we're accountable for what we do as assessors in our system. Okay, so let's just summarize what we have talked about before we move on to your questions. So the core business for any RTO is the certification of those industry relevant competencies for an individual candidate. It's us saying, yes, this person is competent and can do what is expressed in the unit of competency. The certification has got to be based on a judgment of competency that's made by a qualified assessor, and the assessment process must be valid, reliable, fair, and flexible. And of course, they are our principles of assessment. The judgment has got to be based on evidence that's gathered through assessment tools, and that evidence has got to be valid, sufficient, current, authentic, and they are our rules of evidence. And the RTO and the individual assessor are accountable for the validity of the judgments that they make. So there is, again, I've said this before, quite a lot for us to think about and consider, not only as an RTO putting a validation process in place, but also as an individual assessor in how we actually conduct the training and assessment. So we're not going to touch on it yet, but we are going to show you a slide where there are links to resources that are available from the TAC website. That includes a fact sheet that has just been updated for the early changes to the standards on validation. There is also information in there about the assessment process, and there are webinars and workshops where those recordings are available to you on the TAC website. So what we're going to do now is move to your questions. Okay. No. So they can be part of a validation team. So that validation team has got to have someone involved in it that is not the deliverer or the assessor. So they won't be making the decision by themselves. The assessors, the trainers and assessors cannot make the decisions by themselves. Okay, good question. They're all good questions. The record keeping requirements for in-use validation. So in our standards as they are now, there is no real specification around what records you need to keep. So when you have a look at the standards, it just says that you record the outcomes and you can show how you have used them for improvement purposes. If you are conducting in-use validation, which most of you are, you just don't call it that, it would be how you captured that. And so most of you have either some kind of improvement register, you might have meetings where you discuss these things. Those documents that you already have and already use are your records. You're just including it as information to help you improve the training and in particular the assessment system that you have in your RTO. So you won't find anywhere a specific list of records that you need to keep. It's a matter of how you record outcomes from all your improvement activities and how you track that the changes that you decide to make as an RTO have been implemented and they are working. Yes, we can definitely comment on this. And, you know, this is a situation where some of the, you know, I don't know if you're regulated by TAG or by ASQA, or it could be the VRQA, but the regulators do have different ways in which they respond when you have non-compliance found in audits, and a lot of it is actually about the assessment. So this is not uncommon to find that there's an issue with the tools. A lot of people will look at that previous validation as a bit of a tick and flick activity. It's not, it's incredibly important. And when you get to the situation where in your ITO you think, well, maybe we've made these people competent when they really shouldn't be, it's that whole risk-based approach that then comes into play. So you would need to have a look at the risk that your decisions pose for the student and the workplaces that they are in. You might find that when you have a look at that risk, there is no real significant risk to the student, and you might be correcting things going forward. You might also look at that and go, actually, there's a real problem here, and we as an RTO should take some action to rectify the problem that we have created. That might involve a little bit of extra training. It might involve some reassessment. It might involve, you know, if it's a particular cohort in a particular business, it might be some advice to the business about how to manage that cohort. But there, again, there's not a standard way of dealing with this. I would suggest you use a risk-based approach, and your response should be aligned with the risk that you identify in the problem you created. Okay, well, I think this question is actually linked a little bit to the previous one. When you do that, of course, there's always this constant improvement. It's really about saying, well, how bad was it? And what's the consequence of bad? You know, our tool was, what's the risk associated with it? What should we do to make sure that we are making sure that people are competent in the workplace and they're safe to do what they're supposed to be doing? So, you know, there are times when it will have zero impact on the people that sit behind or have been previously assessed as competent. And there will be times when, as an RTO, you decide we need to go back and do something about this. Good question. I actually think that they are two terms that are about the same thing. The reality is continuous improvement is a blanket term that is put on everything that we do in an organisation to improve the quality of what we do. In-use validation just focuses us on a series of, or a set of data that we could use to improve what we do. So I would say one is a subset of the other. In-use validation is a subset of all of the continuous improvement activities that you do in your organisation. Okay, current in terms of assessment validation. So are we talking about the assessor, or are we talking about the evidence? So I'll answer it in two ways. Often when we're looking at currency of evidence, it's linked to the RPL process. And so when someone is bringing evidence to you to have considered as part of the assessment process, you have to decide if that evidence is current. So some training packages, very few, tell you what currency means in their training packages, but most are silent. And they rely on your industry engagement process for you to understand that this is how industry operates today. And when changes have happened, and therefore what might be considered current, in terms of evidence. When we're talking about the trainer assessor, again, it is the same concept of your industry engagement process explaining to you what's relevant and current for industry today, and therefore whether your trainer assessor has that knowledge and skill. We do have, and actually while I'm at it, we do have a fact sheet that talks about industry engagement. I've also got one that talks about vocational competence and industry currency, and that might have some more information that's helpful here for this question as well. Okay, this is where we're talking about our samples. So if you have 5 qualifications on your scope of registration, somewhere in that 5 years, you're going to validate each of those qualifications. You're going to use that concept that we talked about in terms of risk rating, the units, to decide which units you might look at. So we would say you're going to pick a minimum of 2 units from each of those qualifications based on risk rating. Depending upon what you find, you might include more units. So when you go through and you have a look and you do the validation of those 2 units, if there are issues, then you might say, okay, we need to look a little bit further and we're going to do some more validation on different units within that qualification. But the very minimum will be 2 units from each of those 5 qualifications based on risk rating. Sampling again. So sampling, yes. So I guess the first thing I want to say here is our sample size that we start with is always our best guess at what's going to give us a good view of what is happening. And it's a bit of an educated best guess because we are going to look at the different cohorts. We're going to look at the different assessors. We're going to include RPL. We are going to include different modes of delivery. And we are going to look at a couple of students from within each of those different cohorts to give us our stratified random sample. Now, there's some other things that come into that. So, for example, if you are an RTO that maybe only delivers qualifications and you might deliver the qualification once every 2 years, so your student numbers are going to be pretty low. You might also be an RTO that has shorter courses, so you might only offer skill sets, for example. You offer the skill sets multiple times in a week and you put through thousands and thousands of students. The sample size for those 2 different kinds of RTOs is going to be different. So you have to look at your own delivery and assessment in your RTO, figure out all your different cohorts and the assessors. So look at what we call my brain's completely blank. Look at all those things that are going to give you the different cohorts, so the groups that you have to have a look at, and then have a think about what that size is. Now, when you think about that size, you might in fact find when you're doing the validation that you're not confident that you have got a good representation of what's happening in your RTO. When you're feeling like that, you're going to increase your sample size. So it's important to be able to explain the logic of what you have done. And that is what we're looking for when we are doing audits, that the logic is there for your sample and your sample size, and you can explain those things to us. And it is giving you information that you're then able to use to make improvements. Okay, next question. No, that was an easy one. So 1.8 requires that we make sure that all of our assessments meet the requirements of the unit of competence, and you wouldn't get a situation where you would not pre-validate a unit. We would not recommend this. My suggestion to you would be that you go back to the owner of the accredited course and provide them with feedback. Owners of accredited courses have a responsibility for gathering feedback and improving the training products that they have written and own, and that would be how you should address this issue. Okay, so I think we must have gotten through all of our questions. So as promised earlier, we've got a list of the references and resources that we have used to put together this webinar for you. So we have the stands for RTOs, of course, and we do have that new version. So if you haven't already downloaded it and have a look, please do. We have the tax users guide for the standards, and of course the other regulators also have users guides. And we have a number of fact sheets that we have used for this presentation. They are listed there. They're all available from TAC's website for you to download, and where there is a linked webinar, of course you can download that as well. So please take advantage of the information that is there for you. TAC also has a YouTube channel that you can access, and we also have a number of podcasts that give you bite-sized little bits of information about some of these areas. So if you haven't already had a listen, please access those and listen. So the links to all of those, of course, are sitting there on the slide in front of you now, and we would love your feedback on this webinar and any improvements that you think we can make to that. There's a survey link there available for you, and there is also a link to TAC's PD calendar where you can see all of the upcoming PD events that we have planned for you. TAC is always interested in feedback about what you think you need in terms of professional development. So again, you can use the email address that is there to provide any suggestions for what you think the sector needs in terms of future PD. So thank you very much for joining us today. We hope that you have taken away some useful information that you can use in your own validation processes to help you improve what you do, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we hope that we see you again soon. Thank you.